All right, sewing friends, our next step is going to be assembling our slipper upper. So the first thing I want to point out when you're doing this is it's always good to lay out all of your pieces so you make sure you have all your rights together and all your lefts together. Because every time I try to just make one at a time, I always screw it up. So I'm going to save you the trouble and teach you that we're going to assemble everything at the same time. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to just set my minky aside. We're going to work with that in a minute. I'm going to take my batting and my fabric. Now you're going to notice, you may notice this on the template, there's a small notch on one side, and I'll show you that. If I open this up, fold it in half, you can see that one side cuts in slightly. This is really important. That is where your slipper upper is going to match up with your inside of your foot. So we really want that curve to end up in the right place. So we're going to pay really close attention when we're putting these together to make sure that we get all of our pieces lined up just so. So I'm going to take my batting and I'm going to lay it so I have a right and a left. You can see here I've got my two notched pieces on the inside. I'm going to do the same thing with my fabric. I'm going to lay it so I have the right pieces together. Being really careful to watch that notch. If you're worried about keeping track of that notch, one thing you can do is mark it with either a stitch or a pin after you cut it out. Then you will always know what your insides are. If you're thinking that, oh, I'm not really sure what that, if I got that there, you can always line it up with your template to make sure that you're doing it right. If you get that on the wrong side, it will change the fit of your slippers and the overall look. So let's just make sure that we check it now and get it right. The other thing I want to point out to you is that I've never had a pair of these match up perfectly, and I've made hundreds. Your batting is always going to be slightly different size, no matter how careful you are cutting. Okay, so I've got these lined up. I've got a right and a left, and I'm leaving these aside for now. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to fold this in half. I'm going to match my fabric pieces up because my batting is hanging off just slightly. You can see here I've got my fabric pieces lined up, and I'm just going to trim this batting down so that I've got it all, so I know that I'm sewing on the right seam. Okay, so I've got a nice clean edge there. I'm going to pin this. And then I'm going to take this to my sewing machine and I'm going to use 1/4 inch seam allowance, and I'm going to sew the heel. For all of you who are not used to using a back stitch, I want you to start now. We're going to back stitch. We want these slippers to be super durable. Super durable. So we're going to back stitch at each end. All right, and then I'm just going to go ahead and clip my threads, and I'm going to move on to the next piece. If you're a quilter and you're used to starting off the edge of your fabric and then sewing onto your fabric, one thing to note is that it doesn't work really well when you're sewing through this many layers. So start on your fabric and then backstitch close to the edge there, but try to stay on the fabric all the time. Sometimes with this many layers it gets sucked down into where your bobbin is. We want to try to avoid that happening. So I'm going to come close here to my edge, but then I'm going to backstitch, always keeping that fabric under my needle. All right, we're going to repeat the same step with our soft insides. In this instance, I'm using Cuddle. I'm just going to put my right sides together, match up the heels, and sew. It's the same thing on this. We want to make sure that the needle is always on the fabric. Don't try sewing from off of your fabric onto onto it, start with your fabric. You can see here, my needle is on the fabric. I'm going to backstitch to close to the edge, but I'm going to keep my needle on, and then I'm going to move forward. As soon as my needle goes off, it's likely it will get sucked down in there. All right. Now we're going to take our pieces. I always like to identify my right and left at every step to make sure that I keep everything in line. So I'm going to turn these right side out, and I'm going to locate my notches. So I can see that this is my notch, so I'm going to set that towards me so I know that this is my, well, I'll do it this way for the camera. This is my left foot. Then I know that this is my right foot. I'm going to do the same thing with my insides, but I'm going to turn them right sides together because we're going to make this seam next. And I'm going to lay my left foot over the top. I've always had a problem with right and left. And then my right foot over the top here. All right, our next step is going to be, we're going to sew this little circle right here. So I always open up my seams to reduce the bulk that's going to hit the top of your heel. You can use pins or clips for this, and we're going to line up these. All the way around. Now, one thing you might notice if you're sewing with Minky for the first time, or maybe you've sewn with it lots of times and you know this already, but it's actually a knit, so it's going to have some stretch to it. And that's one of the reasons why I want you to be really careful not to force things to line up, because if we force them too much to line up, that knit is going to pull the fabric, the cotton fabric that doesn't have the same amount of stretch to it, it's going to pull it into a certain position when it's all sewn. So we have to be really careful not to force everything to line up. All right, so I've pinned my top together. Now I'm going to take it to my machine and I'm going to sew 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way around the inside. This is another one of those spots where I sometimes like to use my seam ripper to help me get over these bulky seams. So I'm going to tell you a little story while I'm sewing around this. One of the worst classes I ever taught, it went so badly, and I couldn't figure out why it was going so badly. And then was it like a convention where there were a whole bunch of teachers, and the next teacher that stood up after me introduced herself, and she said, "My name is so-and-so, and I believe in perfect sewing." And the class was the same class that I had just taught, and they were so excited about this pronouncement. And I realized that that was probably why I had had such a terrible time in this class, because I don't believe in perfect sewing. I think you should have as much fun as you possibly can while you're sewing. And I think you should do the best job you can while you're sewing, but it doesn't have to be perfect. I am going to fix this little bit right here though. So I hope while you're sewing these, you are having fun and doing the best job you can, but not worrying too much about perfection. All right. All right. So I'm just going to set this one aside, and we're going to focus on this for just a second. I've sewn all the way around the inside here. My next step is I'm going to turn this into the inside. All right, so now we have our basic shape for our slipper upper. And this is when I really love to use those clever clips some more, because we are going to, our next step is to baste around this bottom edge, but I really want to keep this top edge in control. So I'm going to take my clips and I'm going to clip around here, just get my seam nice, and this will work with pins too if you don't have any clover clips. I'm just going to get it nice and even here, just making sure that it's laying nice and flat. All right, you can see how handy these little things are. All right, so now I'm going to go ahead and do the exact same thing on this other set, on my other upper, and then we're going to go ahead and move on to the next step.